Hi, I'm Liz Hirsh Naftali, and I am the host of the Capital Coffee Connection podcast. And the purpose of this podcast is to get to know the heart, the humanity, the home, the hope of our national elected leaders. And I have had the pleasure of speaking with leaders from both sides of the aisle. But the one thing that we all have in common is our heart and our humanity. And that is what I hope people take away from these podcasts. And today I am very excited because I am meeting somebody new, and he is a congressman from Tennessee, John Rose, and he is in his third term. You are Tennessee's 6th congressional district.
That's right.
And so I just want to say welcome. And we're really here to get to know who you are, where you come from, and hear your stories. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure.
So I want to talk about your beginning. And I will just share, I grew up in Los Angeles, and I grew up on a small ranch in Studio City. And it'll be introducing you. But what I wanted to share was that I grew up on a small ranch in Studio City. And one of the things that I loved was watching my father driving the tractor. We had crops, we had horses, and it was just being in a big city of LA, but yet we had this ability to be on a small ranch. And I have most of my fondest memories from growing up there. And it's my way of introducing you because I know that growing up on a farm and being a farmer and the life, and you grew up on a farm that's 230 years old, I understand.
234 this year.
234 this year. So I'd love for you to give us some information and talk about what it was like to grow up on the farm and what this farm represents.
Sure. So to clarify, it's a unique thing about my background is we actually, as throughout my childhood, did not live on the farm. Okay. We lived in a small town nearby, and my dad worked for the farm credit system in those days, but continued to farm. So we spent our afternoons and our Saturdays and our weekends and our summer vacations working on the farm. My grandparents, when I was very young, lived there. And so the farm was kind of an inseparable part of my childhood, and certainly was a passion of my dad's, and it became a passion of mine.
And what were your jobs on the farm? I'm just curious. I mean, I'm sure there were many.
Sure. My dad did a good job from an early age of involving us. I'm the youngest of 4, so it was always me and my siblings, my older siblings. And he had a way of turning work into play. So, when we were young enough not to know better, we thought we were playing, but he was trying to get us to do small chores that, could be communicated to young children and that we could manage. So we did various things. Counting cows, going out in the pastures looking for the cows, counting them. We painted rooftops and painted gates and painted the sides of barns, those kinds of things. We had a problem in those days, a kind of an emerging problem with Canadian thistles that were coming into our pastures. And of course, you could spray to kill them, but my dad would give us a hoe or a shovel and send us out in the field to cut thistles. And one of my earliest really concrete memories when I started to realize I was working and not playing was that I wanted a small motorbike, and my dad was trying to figure out a way, that I could work to get that. And so he offered to pay me a nickel for every thistle I dug up. And, it was a $400 mini bike. It took a long time to make $400 at a nickel per thistle. So those were the kinds of things he had us do.
Right. I love that. A lot of thistles for a mini bike.
Yes.
What was the production from this farm? What did you all get out of it and produce and sell?
Sure. So through the years, lots of things. But in my lifetime, we primarily were a beef cow-calf operation. We also operated a grade A dairy. We produced burley tobacco. That part of Tennessee is where burley tobacco historically was utilized. We also produced hay and Kentucky 31 tall fescue seed. So we combined that seed and produced that and sold it to customers in the area.
And then you continued. I mean, I'm going to go back a little bit to your childhood afterwards, but just on this issue of the story of farming, talk a little bit about as an adult and what your role has been as a farmer leader in Tennessee? Because I know you've had a few different roles, and I know you saved a state fair. So could you talk a little bit about those things?
Sure. So, that the farm became a passion. I was active in FFA and then studied agricultural economics in both in college and in graduate school. But my goal was to come back to the farm. And so I was looking for a profession where I could earn a good living in a small town. And I needed to be able to buy out my 3 siblings from the farm operation. So that was always on my mind. And so that all took me in a little bit different direction. And so my career has actually been, interestingly, in the information technology space, and we can talk more about that. But there came a time when my business was successful. We ultimately sold it when I was still a fairly young man, and I got to turn my attention back to the family farm. And then, because of that, ended up with an opportunity to serve as Tennessee's Commissioner of Agriculture for a fairly short period of time. But that all allowed me to kind of re-engage with my agricultural interests and roots. And then later, as you mentioned, I got called upon to chair our Tennessee State Fair Board at a tumultuous time when the city of Nashville was trying to exit its century-plus-old role. And so those are the things that I've done in the agricultural space.
Which are beautiful. Thank you. And talk a little bit about your district. I mean, from the perspective of the people you serve, because I do believe so many don't understand. They think you show up in Washington, you're up there's battles, but I understand one of the most important roles of a congressperson is the constituents in their communities. Talk about like some of the stuff that you do, but also who the people are that you represent.
Sure. So probably the best way to approach that is to talk about the demography of the districts, the demographic of the district. So my district is part or all of 19 counties, and that's been true. We did have a redistricting, so it changed a little bit. So today I represent part of Davidson County, which is Nashville, Tennessee, about 25-30% of that county. And it comprises 25% of the population of my district. So a small part of one county is a quarter of the district.
Right.
The next over adjoining county, which is kind of a suburban county for Nashville, Sumner County, is another 25% of the population. So those two counties, 50% of the population. The rest of the district is east of Nashville, all the way over into East Tennessee, and represents about half the population of the district in 17 counties.
Yeah.
So
and I'm assuming that's rural?
That's very rural, yeah. Small towns, including the town where I live today, Cookeville, which is where I grew up and is a small town, about 40,000 population. The county has about 80,000. It's a college town, so it is a little bit more, a little more active life there than in some of those small towns across the district. So that's the group of people. And politically, as you might imagine, the Nashville population is in a different place politically than the rest of the district. So in Nashville, Davidson County, the mix is 75% Democratic, 25% Republican. Everywhere else in the district, it's majority Republican, culminating in the far east of the district where in the last election, in the general election, I got 91% of the vote. So a range of different views, but predominated by that kind of rural, suburban, small town America, small town Tennessee mindset with a heavy importance of agriculture.
Right. Well, that's who you represent. Doesn't matter which side of the aisle. Those are the people that you are there to serve and to help. So we've jumped around. Like, talk a little bit about growing up there, what it was like just to be a child in those times, and what school was like, and what kind of things you were interested in. Obviously, you worked on the farm, but what was it like just as a young person growing up?
Sure. So again, growing up in a small town, the 70s, primarily 70s, very early 80s. I graduated from high school in 1983. And, as a kid, obviously you don't necessarily have a full appreciation for the world around you, but some of my earliest memories are of things like the moon landing. I have a distinct memory of watching the original moon landing on TV. And then the Vietnam War and the protests are something that as a child kind of stood out in my mind as I was growing up. And a little bit of the social upheaval of those times. I can remember as a third grade student, we recited the Lord's Prayer in public school every day and had a devotional. But we knew that was changing. I had a teacher who was probably putting up a bit of a protest of her own, right? So you were aware of those things, but mostly just, being a typical kid, enjoying that. My background was a little different because we lived in a small town, and so I sort of saw that side of life. But then my dad was farming, and so we had what oftentimes I saw as a kind of a break from being in town and being at home, the opportunity to be on the farm and get to kind of spread my wings and go out on your own and learn the lessons of life from watching what happens on a farm.
Yeah, it's a good balance. It seems like a very good balance for a child.
It was.
Did you have a teacher, young or later on throughout high school, college, that is still somebody that you reflect upon who really mentored you or inspired you?
Several, I would say. Probably the first person who I would say really made a lasting impression was my major professor in college, a guy named David Nary, Dr. David Nary. And he was a determined liberal, but a very kind of open perspective on learning and knowledge. And really, he was the first person to quote to me the oft-quoted, observation that when you're young, if you're not a liberal, you don't have a heart. And when you're older, if you're not a conservative, you don't have a mind. He taught in that way all the time, even though I could know from the things he said that he was a liberal. He had an open perspective on here's the stuff you need to know in life and how it would be important to you. And he's a person probably that I most often, aside from my parents, I most often think, I wish he was alive so I could call him and ask him a question.
Talk a little bit now about your career, because you are farming beginning and then you still are involved in the tech world, which I think is interesting because one of the things I've also learned is like all of our leaders, they come from different places. And the whole idea is that people bring a different perspective to when they come to Washington, the work. And if we can do it correctly, that's more important than which side you're on, is actually what you can bring from your prior experience. So talk about being in the tech world and how that balances with who you are now.
Sure. The kind of diverse background that I've been gifted to have is very useful in being in Congress, probably the place where it has served me the best. And so having that agricultural background and then trained as a lawyer, though I didn't spend very much time. I'm still a licensed attorney, but I tell everyone I'm a recovering attorney.
Yeah.
And so that has served me well throughout my career. But then there came a point when I was in law school, when a fellow law school student and I started a business in the IT space. It was just a good idea he had, and we pursued that and were blessed, and that was very successful. And so I've spent my whole professional career in the computer technology and training space. Mm-hmm. And so that has, kind of kept me on the cutting edge of what's happening in terms of the development of our technology and our industry and our economy. And so that has served me very well as well. And then I've operated our family farm since the late 1990s. And all of those experiences, particularly the business experiences, have given me a keen appreciation for how government, frankly, can be helpful, but probably more often gets in the way of what Americans are trying to do to create new ideas in the area of entrepreneurship and business growth and development. And so that causes me to have a guarded view. My own view is that government is not really good at doing anything. There are some things that we need government to do because we can't entrust it to the private sector. But as often as we can figure out a way to get government out of operating what could be a business or performing critical functions that could be in the private sector, we should do that because it will be done much more efficiently.
Speaking of efficient and what works well, I understand you have a wife that is very talented, is in her own right a powerful person and a good leader. And what I'd love to know is a little bit about, obviously, you're traveling a lot and you have to go back and forth. So how do you balance between being a leader, being a businessman, and being a husband and a father? And how does your wife support the work you do? And talk a little bit about who she is.
Sure. Well, there's no question that I'm in Congress today because of Chelsea, my wife. And I focused on my career really to a fault as a young man and really did not seriously, pursue finding a relationship, finding a wife until I was well into my 40s. I wouldn't recommend that, but that's how it worked. And it has worked out well. I've been blessed in that regard. And so there came a time when I met Chelsea. She asked me out and I declined, which is another whole story. But she is just a remarkable person, mature beyond her years. She's younger than me, but the most mature woman that aside from my mom, that I'd say I have had the pleasure of knowing in life. And so she was important in getting me involved in politics because I was inspired by her ability to lead and her ability to communicate. She has a graduate degree in communications and has a full-time job, and we have 2 children. But as we were starting our family, we were walking down the road at our farm one day, and I was picking up trash. And something I did often and you have to do on a farm. I was complaining about the lot of the country, the condition of the country. I was upset in those days. It was 2017 about what was happening in Washington. I was complaining about it. We had recently heard that my predecessor that held my seat in Congress was thinking about running for a different office. And I was complaining about all these things. And she said, well, I wish you would either shut up or do something about it.
Good for her.
And I said, well, I support candidates. I'm involved in these issues. What would you have me do? And she said, well, you should run for office. And that was something that a few times people had asked me about, but I'd really never seriously contemplated that. And so in the days ahead, we talked more. I told her, and I still think I'm right about this, that she should run. She had the good wisdom to know that if we were starting a family and we were going to have young children, that might not be practical.
For now.
For now.
Yeah.
And you're right. And so she ultimately convinced me that I should do it. And every day she's involved in, fashioning the message that we could try to communicate and giving me advice and counsel. We don't always agree. She could be pretty fiery about that when she doesn't agree with where we're going or what we're doing in our office. But it's always helpful, and I think my staff would tell you she's got a very keen insight and a really good political barometer for what people are thinking and how to communicate messages to them. And so it has worked well. Obviously, we have 2 young sons, 6 and 3 years old, and you have to share those responsibilities. But clearly, when I'm here and they're there at back home, she carries the brunt of that responsibility.
Yeah, yeah. And just as a quick note, I know that your son became very famous because you brought him with you to Congress. And did he get the appetite to run for office as well when he was there, or he just had fun day with Dad and got to see what you do?
I think a fun day with Dad. He got to eat lots of M&Ms and was unsupervised by Mom for a week, so that he was able to spread his wings a little, as he obviously did on the floor of the house,
yes,
unknown to me. And so I think he had a good time. He is a good kid. But like most 6-year-olds, you can't really script what he does,
No, you should not.
I delivered him he just finished kindergarten. And so several times this year, I would drop him off at his kindergarten. And every day when we'd get to the school, the principal would be standing out front, opening the door to let kids out of their car or get them off the bus and make sure they got into the school safely, Mr. Fry. And Mr. Fry would always have a smile on his face and a very upbeat, cheerful attitude. And he would say, "Good morning, Guy. How are you today?" And every morning, Guy would be like, like, "Don't want to talk to the principal. That might get you in trouble," and he would march into school. And so I tried all year to get Guy, keyword, to get Guy to say, "Good morning, Mr. Fry. How are you this morning?" Never could get him to do it. But then, of course, you put him on the house floor and say, "Smile at your brother," and you see what you get.
Yeah. Before we go a little bit further, I just want to go back to your family, because I understand that you really had a very powerful, influential mom and grandparents. Could you talk a little bit about what they brought to you? Because, I always say it takes a village to raise a child.
Sure. Well, my mom was very influential. She was a teacher trained as a home economist, and she taught home economics. And before that served as they used to call them home demonstration agents. She worked in a day when the home agent in Tennessee and elsewhere around the country had to be single. So when she got married, she had to quit that job. That sign of the times, I guess. I didn't know this about her as a young man, but later as I got older and we were looking at her high school annuals, we saw that her aspiration was to be president of the United States. And she was valedictorian of her senior class. And so she was quite accomplished. We used to chide her as kids because, as I guess it was the teacher in her, if you asked her any question, you got a long answer, a very complete answer. And so that we used to have the joke of I went once to my dad and asked him you might say a home economics related question. And he said, "Why are you asking me? You should ask your mom." And my answer was, "I don't want to know that much about it." and so that was a common theme in our house. My mom was the disciplinarian. My dad, he disciplined by showing disappointment when you failed to live up to what he wanted to do. He never really, there was never any corporal punishment from him, but disappointing him became a powerful motivator, right? And so that was kind of the world. My grandparents on both sides were very different. My mom's dad was active entrepreneur, businessman, did a lot of things. And from him, I learned a lot of, I guess, my ambition about business and creating economic activity. He used to say, I've sold the earth by the board foot, by the pound, by the ton, by the square foot, and by the acre. And he spent his whole life kind of as a business promoter and explorer, producer of things. My other grandfather was a farmer, a fairly simple farmer, but I learned some important lessons from him. Probably the most useful one throughout life is he said, if you ever want something so bad that you can't walk away from it, you won't get a good deal. And so you've got to convince yourself that you never want something so bad that you can't walk away from it. And if you have that mindset, you'll get the best deals in life.
That's a good one. And, it kind of leads to where I go next, which is advice. And that's a very interesting and it's a good advice. And I think it goes to also, if you really want something, you have to go fight for it and work hard for it. So my next question, which is, what is the best advice you've received, the worst advice you've received, which you've started to give us, and also maybe advice you would give to folks?
Well, so then balanced by my father's advice, one grandfather, very ambitious, the other hardworking and shrewd, I would say, as a business person. My dad stressed to us always that a great name is better to be had than great riches. And he was a compromiser and somebody who was always trying to look for a way to bring people together and leave a positive impression with people. And so I saw him do a lot of things through life that I kind of scratched my head about and thought, you got taken advantage of. You didn't get the best deal for you or for us as a family. And that lesson really stuck too. And, and I think there's a balance there. I probably haven't always pursued the way that he would go because I saw how my grandfathers were able to go. But I would say, that advice, because I think it applies to really all things in life, is to not get so tracked in on something. And this is useful here in Congress, that you think there's only one way and you're not willing to walk away. Don't get, recalcitrant about things, because oftentimes there ends up being a better way to get what you want and what is best. And it's hard to see that sometimes because we get dialed in on something. And, obviously you learn that lesson as a kid. I see my kids struggling with that, making decisions, choosing between one piece of candy or a different piece of candy. And as a young person, it's that simple. And then you see their regret when they make a bad choice, right?
Over candy.
But that still happens to us, right? We sometimes think, oh, that's what I want. And then, maybe it's a dessert at a restaurant. And then you take that first bite and you're like, ooh, I think I made the wrong choice, Yeah. And that's really what I see in life, is that, most decisions are not something that you can't work back around if you make them. So don't think that everything has this great deal of finality. There are certain things that do, right? Yeah. Choosing a spouse, right?
Right. And you talked a little bit earlier before we started about storytelling and the importance of that. I thought that you had some really nice thoughts on that. Would you share a little
Sure. So I learned this from my wife, Chelsea, remarkably, because I was, I probably should have learned this lesson earlier in life. And I had applied the lesson, even though I didn't fully understand it, of the importance of one's own experiences as a way of communicating ideas or thoughts or leaving an impression on folks. And the truth is, there are no better stories than any of us have than our own stories. And yet, we oftentimes, particularly I see politicians do it, we want to point to someone else's experience. We want to quote another learned or scholarly or influential person when maybe we could make our point better with some story about our own experience. And I saw Chelsea, as a fairly young person, demonstrate that capacity to do that. She used to have a story that she would tell as in her younger days about selling fruit at her FFA chapter and the lessons that she learned from that fundraising activity. It was a really powerful message, and one that till this day I remember because of her personal experience. Yeah. And that's true for all of us.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so now we're going to have rapid questions, get a little to know about who you are. And the first question is, what is your favorite sound?
Birds chirping in the morning.
Mm-hmm. Favorite color?
Blue.
Favorite smell?
Strawberries.
And who is your biggest cheerleader?
My wife.
Favorite ice cream flavor?
Vanilla.
Vanilla. Okay. And if you had one meal, like it was your favorite meal and that was the one meal that you could choose. We talked about choices, not making a mistake. What would your favorite meal be?
I have a simple palate, so cheeseburger and French fries.
And what kind of music? What is your music that you listen to?
I very much like 70s era pop music.
Mm-hmm. And do you have time to exercise?
Not really. I get a lot of exercise here, probably as much so as any place I've ever been in my life, just walking on the campus here on the
You have a lot to
Capitol Hill.
walk. And sports? What is your favorite sport?
Football for watching, and in recent years, college football. I was not an athlete. My dad was not an athlete, and so I never really had that influence as a kid. And so I never developed myself as an athlete, and so I'm more of a spectator on that front.
And do you have a favorite household chore?
Well, my chore at the house is laundry, and so I find it as kind of a release of when I'm folding laundry, just not having complicated things to think about. Although with a wife now and a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, it's becoming increasingly complicated to sort the socks and the shirts because their sizes are starting to get close together. And so that can be a challenge. What
would you say is your superpower?
I think it's my interest in learning, my curiosity, my intellectual curiosity, I think is the thing that serves me best.
It's a nice one. And if you and Chelsea could travel anywhere in the world, where would you two go?
She really enjoys traveling, and we're going to England at the end of this week. But probably I'm thinking about where, we went to Hawaii a few years ago and have enjoyed that. I don't have an active bucket list of places I want to go, but I do enjoy traveling and seeing the country. I've been to all of the states now except for Alaska. And so I guess that's maybe if there's a bucket list item would be to get to Alaska.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we're on the last question, and I really love all the different answers. And my question is, what does joy mean to you? What brings you joy? How do you, if you're joyful, share that joy?
Sure. Well, it's a good question. So I think joy for me is as much so as I can say, seeing other people happy and knowing that I've made them happy. Yeah, so the sharing part of it, I think, is just about smiling. One of my first coworkers when I was practicing law, the receptionist at our law firm, I would greet her every day as I came in. She would greet me, and I would smile at her. And she, after a few months of that, one day she stopped and she said, "You have the best smile. Never conserve that smile. Use it all the time." And so, and obviously that was a way of her sharing joy with me. And so from that, I learned that, there's nothing more disarming than a good smile.
Yeah. Well, on that note, first, I'm smiling. It's really been a pleasure to have coffee with you and to talk to you and to get to know who you are. I would say that I look forward to meeting Chelsea also one day. And just thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. And thank you for your perspective and for really sharing who you are, your authenticity, because I do believe that what we need in our country, in our world, is to be able to share with each other and have these conversations. And I've learned your stories and they stay with me. So I want to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I think you're right about bringing people together. We need to have more conversations like this on Capitol Hill among members of Congress because it does bring us together. And when you talk with someone and you learn who they are, it changes your perspective and very often then leads to a whole different mindset about working together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Liz. Please join me every Tuesday for coffee to talk about heart and humanity with our elected leaders. Remember to hit subscribe to get an alert when a new episode is live and for exclusive content. Ciao.